Hello, I'm glad you found your way to this link for the mini lecture on John Donne for Ms. Montgomery's English 243. A little bit of biographical background for John Donne. He's born in 1572 in that latter half of the Elizabethan reign, and he's born into a Catholic family. And this is a time when we're past the age of Bloody Mary, but there is still social and political marginalization of English Catholics. And he struggles to make his way as a young man, but it finally becomes clear that he's going to need to publicly convert to Anglicanism in order to have full access to the court and church machinery of power and advancement. But this is a vexed conversion for him. It is not a simple process. 1598, he goes into service as the private secretary to Sir Thomas Egerton, who was Lord Keeper of the Great Seal, a royal courtier. And in 1601, Donne does something that is more controversial the closer to the throne and the closer to power you are. He secretly marries Egerton's niece, Anne More. And this was, of course, not okay with her uncle. They did not have permission. And it started them on a life of love and happiness, but of financial and material and some social difficulty. Donne actually loses his royal position, spends a little time in prison for this secret marriage, and later he would sort of doodle this little image of John Donne plus Anne Donne equals undone to refer to the social and financial troubles that came along with this secret, not sanctioned marriage. And in addition to their struggles for money and status, they also produced 12 children, many mouths to feed. And so finally, as you see in the reign of James I, he has to formally accept a clergy position, accept that's going to be his path to advancement, and he doesn't do so badly there. He becomes the Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, which still to this day is a rather prestigious position in the Anglican hierarchy. But there's always that doubt. There's always that sense of pressure and sense of mixed motives as to why he was doing this. And in the 1635 edition of his works, they're broken out into several sections you see here: the songs and sonnets of love poetry, various epigrams or witty sayings, love elegies, epithalamia, or specifically marriage poems. He wrote a lot of great social satires of court and church life. Also wrote letters, wrote funeral sermons that survive, and two more sections on the progress of the soul, and then of specifically religious poetry. He wrote in a variety of forms. He did a lot of Petrarchan sonnets. The Italian poet Francesco Petrarch was an important influence for English Renaissance writers. And they would, of course, consist of 14 lines, divide into an 8-line section and a 6-line section. And you see a couple of the rhyme scheme variants there, and you'll see those later in the poems. And he was rather experimental. He worked with a lot of rhyme schemes and a lot of rhythm structures. And Ben Jonson didn't always look too kindly on this, among other critics, as you see here. But Donne, again, was, reluctantly or not, a clergyman and is equally famous for his sermons and his devotional writings. And the critical and public reception of Donne and the understanding of his work as we have received it today is this idea of the metaphysical poets. We've talked about Herbert, Herrick, Donne, Lovelace, Crashaw, and others. But this is a term that is created later by scholars, by critics, by people like us looking back. But he is certainly concerned with life, with love, with the essential nature, with what it means to love, with what it means to be alive, with what it really means to have faith or to have union with another human being. And there's a phrase that makes the rounds that he is love's philosopher, or the philosopher of love. Again, that metaphysical, the ineffable, those things that you can't quite see, or you can't quite touch, can't quite conceive of. The next several slides go through the specific poems I asked you to focus on for today, and they will springboard you into the extra credit discussion board. So you see I've taken apart the rhyme scheme and the syllable structure of The Flea here, and some highlights. It's obviously a mocking poem. It's a rather ridiculous poem. It is sexual seduction, and it looks at that joining of lovers as completion, both the idealized human-to-human consummation and then the rather absurd consummation of the flea penetrating and biting you. And then when the flea swells up, that suggests pregnancy, and we also get kind of an interesting reference in the middle of a rather funny poem to King Herod. So this might be a rather naughty poem, or it might be a rather flirtatious poem, but then it's also, we see, a rather serious poem. The Good Morrow. Again, you see the breakdown of structure and rhyme. And the major images here to pay attention for are the images of sexual union, the images involving geography and space and travel, images really of mutuality, of opposites, this idea of a very egalitarian love between man and woman, where they are halves of one whole, where they are different but complementary, both necessary, both depending on each other. This is not, as we will see, the Christopher Marlowe vision, or even perhaps the Shakespeare's vision, where you have the lover and the beloved, with really one acting and one responding, but really two lovers and two beloveds. It's a very mutual image. In The Sun Rising, we have that sense of mutuality, of love, combined with politics and the geocentric theory of the universe. You can't get much bigger than that. Remember, this is an era when plenty of people still think the sun revolves around the earth, and here the poem speaker is saying the sun doesn't revolve around the earth, the sun revolves around this bed, the site of this love. And she is all states and all prince's eye, nothing else is. Kind of reminds you of Julian of Norwich, the whole of creation in a walnut shell. Here it's the whole of love and the whole of existence, right in this one bed. The bait is part of that wonderful tradition we talked about of responses to Marlowe's passionate shepherd to his love. And this is a more honest pastoral. You look at some of the stanzas, we have our characters getting their hands dirty and getting hurt and working hard to live off the land. It's not some idyll. And it also focuses, notice especially the last couple of stanzas, on that notion of consent and agreement, not being caught by seduction, as the valorized and celebrated version of love here. Valediction Forbidding Morning is another of Donne's more serious poems. As you see in your footnotes, there is some evidence that this was a poem Donne wrote to his wife when he had to be away on the continent. But there's also some speculation that this was written after Donne got the news of one of his wife's miscarriages. In addition to the 12 live children they had, of course, this is an era where there is no contraception, that women are often continuously pregnant for about 20 years in a realistic sense. And of course, pregnancy is always dangerous in this era. So that is one of the other possible inciting incidents for this poem, is the miscarriage of a child. And probably then the most famous part of this poem is the compass imagery, where think of a compass. It's useless without the two halves. It will just fall over and it won't do anything. It won't draw anything. It won't show you anything. So we have, again, that mutuality, that two halves of one whole that depend on each other and act together. So you think of erectness in love poetry, you might think of Herrick's The Vine, for example, but this is really not a overtly gendered version. It's a more subtle image than that. And again, the mutuality, both halves are needed to form the whole, are needed to send him out, and are needed to bring him back again. Death Be Not Proud is one of the holy sonnets. It's one of Donne's most famous poems. You might have read it in 112 here at Blue Ridge. It is a Petrarchan sonnet. It is devotional. It asserts these claims of faith, and ultimately our upshot is that death beats us all, but God beats death. And fate, chance, kings, other authorities deploy death. And eventually death, thou shalt die. Death is perhaps not so powerful after all in the grand universal scheme, and death is unable to act alone. Holy Sonnet 5, another holy sonnet, gives you, again, this combination of the Petrarchan sonnet form of Christian imagery and scientific imagery, and just as he offers mutuality and different halves in his love poems, he's offering traditional and new ways of viewing the world in his religious poems, rather appropriate for somebody who inhabited both Catholicism and Anglicanism and thought and wrote deeply about his religious convictions and experiences. And here's just a little bonus, a corona of sonnets by Donne. See the description there of a corona is the crown of sonnets, where the first line of a poem is the last line of the previous poem, and so on around. They form a circle. The last line of the last poem is the first line of the first poem. And you see his subject matter here lends itself nicely to a cyclical structure. Lady Mary Roth, who you read for today, also produced a corona of sonnets. And then if you are interested further in John Donne, here are some additional sources. And these sources also contributed to the biography. And I thank you for your attention, and stay tuned for the extra credit prompt.